Shalom, friends. Welcome back to Judaism Unplugged. I'm Rabbi Steve Wiseman of Temple Solel here in Bowie, Maryland. And this is the fourth in our series of short history vignettes. This one, the period of the early kingship, entitled, They Might Be Kings. We're looking at a period that begins someplace in the late 11th century BCE, probably within a couple of years, give or take the year 1020 BCE. And how we get to the point where the children of Israel settled in the land, ask for a king, and wish to become a monarchy like many of the surrounding nations, is actually a big part of the story of this period. If you recall, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses dies on the edge of the promised land, leaving Joshua in charge to lead the people in. Excuse me. Throughout the books of Joshua and Judges, the reader, we, are presented with a story of a united people under a single leader at any time. First, Joshua, having taken over from Moses, who brings us across the Jordan River into the land and begins the process of leading the people into capturing towns and cities and claiming the land so that eventually we can settle in it and divide it up amongst the 12 tribes. And that conquest begins with the story of the fall of Jericho. And it continues with a series of other conquests. But by the end of the book of Joshua, the land has still not been completely taken. And what's clear in both the books of Joshua and Judges is that there are natives in the land. There are Canaanites who consider this land theirs, about whom God says we need to wipe them out completely, not because they've done anything to offend God or harm us, but because as long as they exist next to us, they will always be a potential snare and a lure away from God for us. We may be tempted to follow their ways, worship their gods. So the process of conquest and settlement and dividing up the land continues into the book of Judges. A really unique biblical book in that the judges, the Shoftim in Hebrew, are each portrayed as a national leader, one following upon the other in the overall editorial sense of the book as a whole. But in each individual story, an individual judge is recognized as a charismatic, heroic figure. And by charismatic, what the historians mean is that there's an element of their personality or their behavior that makes them distinct from others. So the concept of charismatic leadership can be anything from the incredible strength of Samson to the left-handedness of one of the other judges, which allows him to be terribly effective in individual combat in conquest because people who he walks up to innocently are looking to his right hand as the dangerous hand, and everything in between. So there's this period between the entry into the land, and again, going back to the Exodus discussion, depending on where you mark the date of the Exodus, indeed, if you even see a single Exodus as being formative, according to the mainstream scholars, you've got a couple of hundred years to account for between the entry into the land and the arrival of first Samuel as the last of the judges, he who anoints the first of the kings, Saul, in the book of Samuel, and the beginning of the monarchy with Saul. It's a very disjointed time. It's a period that I look at and the biblical historians look at very much as a period that we call proto-history. The history of our people is being formulated in this period. You're seeing almost historical accounting. You're seeing some significant pieces of certain events that can be connected to external documentation, but nothing completely yet. Nothing that is so definitively, clearly historical as to mark the pre-monarchical period as actual history. And indeed, even the start of the monarchical period does not immediately lead to history. So Saul is the first king, chosen by God with God's permission, anointed as king by Samuel, who himself is really the first clearly national judge and leader. And it's to Samuel that the people turn to give them a king. Samuel objects. Samuel, who besides being a judge, is also a priest serving in the shrine, wants to maintain the unique relationship to the one God that makes the Israelites different from all of their neighbors. He says to the people, you don't need a king, you have God. And the people say, we want a king anyway. And God says they want a king, so give them a king, and Samuel relents. Saul is chosen. And Saul is immediately somewhat problematic. He's an effective leader in war and in battle. But sitting around the palace, his emotional state is not as stable as one would hope for. And it's in that balance between the public and the private man that I think you get both sides of the real story of the development of the Israelites as a monarchy. In Saul, you get a character who is both externally and to all appearances an outstanding candidate to be named king, but who internally is dealing with demons. And that's where the story takes off from. When it brings a young boy, a harpist, a musician, into the court of King Saul to help him with his distemper. And that young harpist, that young lad, is none other than David, who we know as readers is destined to become Saul's replacement, the second king. Now, there's a huge historical problem during Saul's kingship, and it involves David. Young David is already making a reputation as a pretty good fighter himself. And when the Philistine giant Goliath challenges the Israelite army to one-on-one combat, no one is quick to step forward because nobody feels themselves capable of defeating Goliath. Along comes young David. And in a story we know well, he slays the giant. But it's in the aftermath of that story that we get the historical inaccuracy, probably one of the worst in the biblical text. Because after killing Goliath, David cuts off his head and sends it to the king in the capital, Jerusalem. Now, on the face of it, there's nothing unusual here, except that Saul's capital wasn't Jerusalem. Jerusalem wasn't in the Israelites' hands. And it wouldn't be until King David, grown and become king, 7 years into his reign, captures the city and makes it his capital. So yes, do I believe that David killed the Philistine giant? Why not? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. And if he didn't really do it, is it any worse than the stories we have in America of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and telling his father, I cannot tell a lie when confronted, which probably never happened? Or of Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac when A, there were no dollars yet because we were still under British rule, and B, he would have been far more likely to throw it across the far narrower Rappahannock River further south, where he was born and raised. But David cutting off the head and sending it to Jerusalem, that's problematic. That's a big problem. And externally, there's little to no evidence of a King Saul. Indeed, the first truly historic reference we have, the first external proof that we have, comes from an inscription found at an archaeological site up north in Israel, Tel Dan, the Hill of Dan, the tribe of Dan, which refers to the house of David, Beit David, which would have been David's descendants. It seems to indicate David is an actual historical figure. Or certainly a cultic figure. So even that's not completely clear, but that seems to be the archaeological find that has pushed the envelope between the border between proto-history and history back to the character of King David himself. And David comes to the kingship in about the year 1000 BCE, give or take. It's a nice round number. It's an easy number to remember. And as we've already noted, amongst the first things that he does as king is he captures Jerusalem. And upon capturing it, because of its somewhat central location and the fact that it has never been dispersed to any of the tribes themselves, he declares Jerusalem to be his capital. And that act unifies the 12 tribes under the single King David with a capital that everybody agrees upon. And that act seems to be the historic point from which, at least to this point, we can begin to read Jewish history moving forward. Again, in that period prior to King Saul, when it was Joshua and then the judges, and we were entering and conquering and settling the land as a people, the stories seemed to be regionalized. Samuel truly was the first character, as we noted, who was recognized across all of the tribal lines throughout all of the regions that would come to make up the United Kingdom of Israel. And so someplace between Samuel and David is the point at which we know for sure that we have a 12 tribal confederacy called the Israelites or the Jews. And from a historical perspective, that's somewhat significant. Because if we go back and read the earlier Torah stories about the origins of this people really closely, as historians are wont to do, there are actually two distinct tales being told, if we're open to seeing them. The one that I think we've all learned in religious school, regardless of our religion, I think, is that the 12 tribes all trace their ancestry back to a single individual. That was Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. They went down to Egypt together. They were enslaved there together. They were led to freedom by Moses together after 10 miraculous plagues. They agreed to serve God together at Mount Sinai. They wandered in the desert together for 40 years, and together they conquered the land of Canaan and settled in it. That's the history we're supposed to see. That's the history the texts want us to see. but buried, hidden, but still visible if one looks closely. There's another version of that history. A history that actually, when one thinks about it, may make at least as much, if not more, sense from a practical perspective as to how this tribal confederacy called the Israelites came into being. And I need to throw in a Greek technical term here. It's a fancy word. I like to throw it around. Amphictyony. An amphictyony is a tribal confederation, traditionally of 12 distinct member units, formed around a central shrine for two primary shared purposes. One is the serving of the shrine. The other is the leadership of the common defense force. The tribes pledge to work together to worship God or gods, to protect themselves and each other. And the size of 12 is important because it allows the responsibilities to be shared amongst each tribe, taking leadership for each of those tasks for 1 month in each year. It's a Greek word in origin. It comes from the ruler of the federation around the Oracle of Delphi and the shrine there, perhaps amongst the most famous in Greek history and religion. And it appears fairly obvious that the Israelites were similarly organized, given the centrality of the 12 tribes. However, when one looks at listings of the 12 tribes internally, throughout the period of Torah and into Joshua and Judges, one finds that their internal structure is defined not by their father Israel, but by their mothers. And if you remember the story, Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubine wives, the maids of his 2 main wives, each of whom provided at least 2 sons whose names are given over to tribes. And when we break down the 12 tribes into their mother subgroups, is when things get really intriguing. Rachel has 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. There is no tribe of Joseph by the time we enter the land. There are tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, his 2 sons, who were directly blessed by Jacob before he died as a way to give the doubled portion to Joseph by giving a portion each to his 2 sons directly. Joseph, we know, was the one who went into Egypt and was the one who brought us in the story, all the rest of the family, into Egypt during the famine. So there is a clear focus in the stories of Joseph and his sons on and in Egypt. Rachel's other son was named Benjamin. When he's born in Genesis chapter 35, Rachel, the beloved wife of Jacob, dies in childbirth. Her last act, her last words, are to name her son Benoni, son of my travail, my pain, my suffering. If we go back and look at Genesis 29 and 30, where all of the other children are born to Jacob, either Rachel or Leah names their own children or those of their handmaid. Jacob has nothing to do with the naming of his earlier sons, not even Joseph. So in the birth of Benjamin, we have this rather strange variation on a larger theme. because Jacob overrides what is effectively his beloved wife's deathbed wish that her newborn son be called Benoni, and Jacob instead names him Benjamin. Benjamin means son of my right, as in son of my right hand. That doesn't seem significant until one remembers that in the ancient world, the typical map of the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, is not oriented with north at the top of the page like we're used to in maps today, but rather with the Mediterranean Sea at the bottom. And therefore, a tribe that is called son of the right hand is oriented southward, which would be towards Egypt. And suddenly, in the three tribes that trace themselves back to Rachel, there's a southern influence and a southern focus that all three of them share in their own way. And it leads scholars to look and historians to look and say, what else can we find when we break down the people in this way? And sure enough, we look to the remaining tribes connected to the handmaids born to Bilhah and Zilpah, and we find amongst them the tribe of Asher, whose name sounds an awful lot like the name of the superpower Ashur, Assyria, who would eventually come to conquer the northern kingdom. And we also find the tribe of Dan, who we have a story during the conquest narrative in Joshua and Judges, started out by Jaffa on the Mediterranean near where Tel Aviv is today, and moved en masse to the North Country. So between a seeming connection and reference to Assyria and a migration northward by the tribe of Dan for settling, we get a sense that these concubine tribes may have come from the Fertile Crescent and be northward oriented back to their origins. In which case the Leah tribes, who number 6, fully half of the Confederacy, may have been the native Canaanites to whom these newcomers attached themselves. Native Canaanites who had grown tired of Canaanite traditions and were looking to find a different way, attracted to what these newcomers brought with them from north and south. And so hiding in this internal structure that's based in the mothers may very well be an alternative history of how the people came to be from different origins, different locales, and different traditions and cultures. Which is why everything before is in a period of prehistory for us as Jews, because the entire story of our coming to the land may have been a deliberately created story based not in history, but in a desire to have a common origin story. And that's why I say it's with David, and now this archaeological find of the existence of a Beit David, where Jewish history actually begins. And if we assume that really the unified people don't come together completely until they have a central capital that they can call their own altogether and not fight over whose it really is, that also becomes the home of the central shrine eventually, although David is stopped by God because he's a man of war from building God's house. That opportunity and responsibility is given to his son Solomon, a man of peace, even in his name, Shlomo, which is clearly related to Shalom. But the idea that in this 77 years between David's conquest of Jerusalem in the 7th year of his reign, the rest of his 40-year rule, and the 40-year rule of Solomon after him, is when whatever final coalescence of this federation of Israelites takes place, that this is the time when Jewish history truly begins. And it begins with a 77-year period when the Jewish people are ruling themselves freely with no outside or internal challenge or interference. It's one of those very few times in Jewish history where we are our own autonomous reality. No competition, no conflict. Jews ruling Jews living freely. And it lasts for 77 years at most. So 77 years may actually be a problem. The fact that both David and Solomon are reported to have ruled for 40 years. Here is one of those unique elements that make historical reportage, or what appears to be historical reportage, in the biblical text so challenging. Because if one does a close analysis of the number 40 in the biblical text, there's a very strong case to be made that it's not intended as a number at all. That going back to the natural elements of time that give us a ones unit for a day and a sevens unit for a week, and roughly a 29 or 30 day unit for a month. When something is referred to as 40, it may simply mean a heck of a lot longer than we could count a month of days, and long enough that we may start to be unable to accurately keep count. Think about the things that are done in 40s. The flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. It's a heck of a lot of days and nights for a rain. The wandering in the desert lasted for 40 years. That's a heck of a lot of years. There's the version of the promise of what would happen in Jewish history made by God to Abraham in the covenant, that his descendants would spend 400 years in a land not their own. It's a heck of a lot of decades, 40 decades. So we may be told, nothing more here, that David and Solomon were the first true kings of the unified confederacy. And they both ruled for a heck of a long time. The time before records were accurately kept. And therefore, it's ascribed to 40 years each. And yes, there are kings who rule longer in the monarchies that follow, but no others that rule for exactly 40 years. And the record keeping seems to get better as we go. So what we have at about the year 1000 BCE, and what makes this so significant, is the dawning of the unified Israelite confederacy under a single human ruler, David and then Solomon, although there was a King Saul reported before David, which 7 years into the reign of David takes on its central capital city of Jerusalem to further unify the people. And we move forward from there. The next dates we're going to look at are going to be the dates in which first the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom are conquered by foreign conquerors, which means that this wonderful beginning of a unified people that lasted through David and Solomon for 77 years does not make it very far. In fact, it doesn't make it past Solomon, at least according to the internal documents. And that from that point on, there is a northern kingdom called Israel, consisting of 10 tribes, and a southern kingdom called Judah, consisting of the tribes of Judah and Simon, and the Levites at the central shrine, because Jerusalem is part of Judah. And despite the challenges of the appearance of a lasting division in which the majority of tribes go one way and the capital and the religious center go the other way, the internal text never talks about a civil war. Not at the time of the break after Solomon's death, and at no time when both North and South were still in existence. There are a couple of times when we seem to be on different sides in larger skirmishes. There are a couple of points where there appears that there may be an attempt by one side to take over the other. But in the end, the period from after Solomon down to the destruction of first the North and then the South is a relatively internally peaceful period, which of course has scholars wondering whether that earlier unified period ever really happened or not. Just adding to the challenges of historicity in the biblical text. But for most historians, David seems to be that critical figure where measurable and verifiable history of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, now begins, which gives us 3,000 years of actual Jewish history. And with our next videos, we'll look at how this monarchy ended first in the North and then in the South, and what happened after that as Judaism continues its march through history. As always, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. You can find my email address on the Temple Solel website. Until next time, shalom, friends, and we'll see you then.